Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you joining us for the Dibble Institute's October 2021 webinar, The Impact of Mind Matters, Preliminary Evidence of Effectiveness in a Community-Based Sample with Dr. Becky Antle, whom I'll be introducing in just a little bit. Before we do that, I want to just introduce and say hello and thank you to our wonderful engineer, Esther, who's behind the scenes and kind of helping everything run during today's session. So, hi, Esther. I'd also like to note for those of you who are here, if you have any tech issues or issues with kind of hearing the presentation, please log out and log back in. That usually does the trick. If that doesn't, you can always go back to the confirmation link that you received for today's webinar and call into the session. The other thing I'd like to point out is that we will have time for Q&A at the end of our session, but please feel free to type those questions into the question box in the control panel, and we will do our best to answer all of them in today's session. Now let's get into a brief introduction into the Dibble Institute before we get into our actual webinar for today. So if we go to that next slide, I just want to highlight briefly good old Charlie and Helen Dibble. A lot of times people ask about the background of the Dibble Institute and kind of the story and where our name comes from. So we want to introduce, like I said, Charlie Dibble, who is the founder of the Dibble Institute. And for those of you who are new to our webinars, Charlie was an engineer who in his retirement time spent a lot of time dedicated to working with young people. And with that, he started to become a little bit more aware of the emotional challenges and their relationship challenges. And these became really evident in the late 80s when he went to his grandniece's wedding. And she said, you know, oh, don't worry, Uncle Charlie, this is just my first wedding. He was like, wait, hold on, what's going on here? And at that time, the divorce rate was really beginning to reach its peak. And between that, what he was hearing and then also seeing with the young people that he was working with, he had heard kind of enough stories and wanted to make a difference. Because as an engineer, he was kind of a Mr. Fix-It as part of his trade. And what he realized was that there was a very little being done to address the needs of young people, especially in the realm of forming healthy relationships. So with the cooperation of some of his colleagues and friends, he founded what is now known as the Dibble Institute. So I want to just tell you who we are now as an organization. We're an independent national nonprofit organization. And if you look at the map there on the screen, for those of you who are joining us on your computers or devices today, you'll see all the states where our clients were in the 2019 to 2020 year. And with this in mind, we estimate that about 67,000 youth, kind of at a minimum, were served in that year, thanks to the wonderful folks like all of you who are on today's webinar who are working directly with youth. So thank you for all the work that you are doing to make an impact on the young people's lives. And Dr. Antle, who is on this presentation today, who we'll get to hear more from in just a few moments. But being an independent nonprofit organization, that means we're really guided by our mission and our values. So I want to take a second to talk about our mission as an organization, because as you heard, we don't do direct surveys, but we work directly with organizations who provide services. And our mission is really about empowering teens and young adults with the knowledge and research-based skills to successfully navigate their intimate lives, because we know that their relationships really do have a widespread kind of impact on other facets and dimensions of their lives and their future. So we want to make sure that they have the knowledge and the skills to successfully navigate those. And again, that's our mission, and our mission is also kind of guided and driven by the values that we hold as an organization. The first one being that we believe in research. So everything in our programs are research-based, and as you see from today's webinar, we also strive to have all of our programs evaluated at the highest level to demonstrate their effectiveness at improving the lives, skills, and knowledge of young people. So we really value and strive for that. The other thing that we believe in is safe, stable, and nurturing families. And we believe this in all forms. And we know that safe, stable, and nurturing families can really make a huge and positive difference in the lives of youth. And everyone should be entitled to these relationships. And similarly, we believe that relationship education is for everyone, that everyone's lives and relationships can be improved by gaining more knowledge and skills to navigate them, kind of regardless of who you are or where you're at in life. Everyone deserves that information. So that's who we are as an organization. Now I want to briefly introduce Dr. Antle before I hand it over to her to talk about her research and this presentation today. So Dr. Antle is a professor of social work and a university scholar at the University of Louisville Kent School of Social Work. Why is that so hard for me to say today? Social work and couples and family therapy program. She's also the director of the Center for Family and Community Well-Being. So she is an esteemed scholar at the University of Louisville. And for those of you who are joining us from the last time she was here to present, which is a follow-up from that earlier presentation and research she's done, you may know that she was selected for the Dibble Institute's first major research project due to her outstanding proposal, which really detailed a high-quality study plan. She demonstrated well-established community partnerships and previous success with similar program evaluations. So we were excited and honored to have her working on this project to evaluate our Mind Matters program, and thank her for being here to talk about it today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Becky.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to share with you what we are learning as it relates to the impact of Mind Matters. This is a pilot study, and I will say that we are continuing to conduct this research and hope to come back and share with you additional results over time. We will continue to implement and evaluate Mind Matters long term in order to continue to add to the rigor of the research that's available in the literature for us to understand not only does this program work, but how and for whom and under what circumstances, building on our implementation science emphasis. Next slide. And so, as Rachel said, I'm the director of the Center for Family and Community Wellbeing at the University of Louisville. We have within the center, I have 17 years of experience and about $15 million in federal funding specifically around relationship and mental health curricula, such as Mind Matters, about $60 million in funding over the years in various forms of research and implementation science. And we have really, over the past decade or so, focused our efforts on several of the programs that you may be familiar with from Dibble, such as Love Notes and others, that have contributed to our field's understanding of teen pregnancy prevention, dating and intimate partner prevention, intimate partner violence prevention, child abuse prevention, and trauma treatment. And so we are involved in a number of programs and research studies across those areas. Because of that background, that really positioned us well to be able to conduct this preliminary evaluation, building on, as Rachel said, our community partnerships. We have long-standing partnerships with organizations not only in our city, but across the state and really across the country, through whom we can engage in community-based research in real-world settings that serve youth that have trauma issues, such as those addressed in the Mind Matter curriculum. Next slide. So just to give you an overview of the Mind Matters evaluation project, for those of you who maybe didn't join us the first time. Next slide. We were evaluating the Mind Matters curriculum, which has 12 modules on overcoming adversity and building resilience. And so this is an evidence-informed curriculum building on brain science and a number of other evidence-based practice areas that is targeting those who've experienced trauma or adversity with two primary goals. We want to help them understand trauma and how it affects them. And then secondly, and importantly, build coping skills across multiple domains to promote healing and positive outcomes. And you'll see as I share the details of our evaluation plan, how we try to address both of those, the improved understanding of trauma and its impacts, as well as the building up of coping skills across domains. So for those of you, let me pause here. We have one of a couple of polls three polls that we'll do today, just to get you a little bit involved, because I know we've all had a lot of months of sitting on Zoom listening to people. Let me do a quick poll to ask you about your familiarity and or use of Mind Matters. So if you can respond to that. And so it looks like from the poll, about 16% of you are actually using the program currently. Almost 40% of you have heard of it but never used it. So you may be familiar with some of the content. I'm going to review that at a high level. And almost half of you have never heard of Mind Matters. So for those of you who have never heard of this program, I am going to give you a little bit of detail of what is included. So when we talk about Mind Matters and its emphasis on building a broad repertoire of coping skills, what we mean by that are skills that are identified here on this slide. So one set of skills that the program covers are things like self-soothing skills. The program actually starts here, and this is a great place to start because these are very foundational skills that are easy to pick up, easy to teach. Youth really enjoy learning and using these, and they're quick rescue strategies, as we like to say, things like breathing techniques, vagus nerve activities, mindfulness activities, and others. We move from self-soothing skills into observational skills, where people really learn to get better in touch with their thoughts, feelings, and what's going on with their bodies, and understanding the interaction of those. So how do our sensory experiences interact with our thought lives, and how that then can produce different sorts of feelings. Learning to name our feelings is important, and then understanding how those work together to produce behavior. There is a section in the program on relationship skills, which is certainly consistent with Dibble's mission, as Rachel talked about earlier. And so it talks about building a support system, building empathy, a loving kindness practice, good listening skills, pieces that we know are really important for people who are overcoming a trauma background, because they often feel disconnected from people in their lives and don't have close relationships. And so this is really a critical piece for them to building a different future. Next slide. The hijacked brain module is embedded right in the middle of the program, and I appreciate the position of that in the program, because we spend a number of modules and a good bit of time with youth building a good relationship. We know from our extensive research on implementation of relationship and other psychoeducation programs that facilitator alliance with participants and group cohesion, building trust among group members, is really critical for uptake of information and skills. And so we don't want to start with really difficult information like that on the hijacked brain, because really what this module, this series of information talks about is helping people identify those trauma experiences they may have had, specifically in the form of ACEs, so our adverse childhood experiences that we often talk about, those 10 significant events that people may have experienced in childhood. We know there are more than those 10, but that tends to be where we start with understanding that. We help them really understand how ACEs impact so many different areas of their functioning and well-being, whether it's their cognitive development and learning issues, behavioral issues, relationship issues, emotional regulation, etc. Not only understanding what those impacts might look like, but why, from the standpoint of how does trauma impact the brain. And it really is so well done, because it comes away with a message of, and this has become one of our catchphrases, not just from this program, but just in general as we do this work in trauma, your past does not have to predict your future. And so the beautiful thing about the brain, even though it can be so significantly impacted by trauma, is that it also has great plasticity and the ability to grow in new ways and in healthier ways, and that's really what we're hoping to accomplish through this program. We then move into additional coping skills, things like self-care, where we talk about physical activity, sleep. We teach them tapping techniques and others. And then lastly, there's a whole section in the program that focuses on intentionality. And these are future building, future oriented, goal directed activities where people are doing values clarification, thinking about short and long-term plans and the supports they need. Because we know one of the impacts of trauma is a foreshortened sense of the future. And we're really helping them through these activities and these modules begin to think beyond next week, next month, next year at best, into the future, and helping their brains grow in that way as well. So that's a really quick overview of a wonderful 12-module program that I can brag on, because we didn't write this or develop this. We were very much the objective outside evaluators, and you can hear from my sharing and description of this program how much we have really appreciated the content over these past 2 years as we've been engaged in this evaluation, not only in seeing the data that I'm going to share with you today from the rigorous evaluation, but also in a more qualitative or anecdotal way, hearing the stories and seeing the experiences of youth who are going through the program. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of how we went about implementing this, we did have several community-based organizations that we trained in the beginning of this grant in order to implement Mind Matters in their programs. These included residential treatment programs, homeless crisis service delivery programs, after-school programs, and then an educational and vocational rehab program. We had, as I said, long-term partnerships with these agencies. We knew they had the capacity to be able to learn and implement a new psychoeducational approach such as Mind Matters, and so we built on that previous partnership with them. We started with establishing this infrastructure by partnering with Dibble and the author of the curriculum to train 28 professionals across those organizations in October of 2019. This was a 2-day training that took them through every module, as well as important facilitation pieces to enhance the quality of the service delivery so that we weren't just focused on content. We then met with each agency to develop implementation plans, and then we provided oversight for those agencies in implementation as well as evaluation in the form of ongoing meetings, supervision, any sorts of supports they needed for the service delivery. I will say that when we got to delivering Mind Matters, we hit COVID. As you can see, our training of trainers happened in October of 2019. And with COVID hitting in February, March of 2020, it had a significant impact on our implementation, which is why this study is still ongoing. And we will continue to implement and evaluate this program at least over the next year, hopefully beyond that, because we're seeing such promising results. And so that became difficult and a real problem-solving exercise, particularly as we were partnered with some residential programs that had a number of COVID outbreaks, and we were partnered with some community-based organizations, a number of community-based and school-based programs that shut down for face-to-face service delivery. And there were concerns about how to do this in an online format, et cetera. And so I'm happy to do a whole separate session or answer questions at the end about some of the ways that we pivoted and made this work. But the short of it is we were still able to implement multiple rounds of Mind Matters with several community partners. I'll get into the details of how many participants we had to date, and we are continuing to do so. We did set this up so that this was a randomized controlled trial. So within those organizations, we had commitments for participants to be randomized to an experimental group that received Mind Matters or a waiting list comparison group that received Mind Matters after the evaluation was complete. So we were not withholding services from anyone. We were just putting on a waiting list for a future round of training. They did receive some swag and some gift cards and things to support their participation. And the groups were facilitated by staff within the organizations, which is one of our success strategies we've learned from previous implementations in terms of building on that facilitator alliance, et cetera, because these are familiar faces. It also promotes sustainability because now these organizations are trained in this approach. And as we work with them on implementation plans, they're really able to think about how to continue to offer Mind Matters in an ongoing way, because they've had to consider how to embed that into treatment as usual, into their normal service array. So within the residential program, for example, they offer coping or resiliency groups that are sort of electives that some of the youth can opt into, and this became one of the options in an ongoing way, not as part of the research because we were randomizing them to conditions. For our educational and vocational rehab program that we partnered with, they again offer a number of workshops. They've offered love notes and other programs in the past, and then they have a number of programs focused on their outcomes related to educational and vocational development. And so now Mind Matters can be one of their ongoing programs that they offer, and that's a really important piece to consider. How can you embed this into your current service array, add it as another option, now that we're starting to see that this is in fact an effective approach to helping youth address some of their trauma history. So then we moved into conducting the evaluation. So youth in each cohort were randomized, as I said, to either the experimental Mind Matters group or the control waiting list comparison group. Youth in both groups completed surveys at multiple points in time. They were a compilation of standardized scales that I'm going to go over here in just a minute, that targeted primarily our outcomes, but also some implementation issues. And then we did conduct a rigorous evaluation of implementation pieces because we know that's really important for establishing the evidence base of any intervention. Next slide. So this is our overview of the evaluation. So by the end of this, and we are our sample, we're at about half of our final sample size that we plan to complete. By the end, we'll have 200 youth. To date, we have a little over 100 with equal numbers in the experimental and comparison group with multiple points of data collection. As I said, we did this training of facilitators. We evaluated that. One of the pieces of our implementation science framework is the evaluation of the mastery of the content and skills by the facilitators themselves. And so we developed a knowledge test based on the curriculum to measure that for our facilitators, make sure that they had minimally acceptable standard of competency in the content. We also evaluated that in terms of their satisfaction with the training of facilitators. For the process evaluation, we developed a Fidelity tool that takes each module in the curriculum and has them self-assess or self-report the extent to which they covered the content and the activities within each module. What we have learned in our previous research on relationship education programs and other psychoeducational programs such as this is that there is a law of diminishing returns, but that obviously high levels of fidelity are important. So we always talk about intervention fidelity or adherence to a curriculum. And what our previous research has shown is that there's a magic window for that. Somewhere between 80 and 93% is what some of our published studies have shown of adherence to a standardized curriculum such as this for optimal outcomes. You would think that 100% would be our target, but what we've actually found is that 100% of adherence or fidelity to a curriculum, there is that law of diminishing returns, because what we then start to see is that facilitators are paying too much attention to the content and sort of reading from the manual instead of attending to the participants and the needs in the room. And so that fidelity form is a sort of accountability measure for our facilitators, but it's also a good discussion point in our ongoing supervision for us to say that piece about we still want you to pay attention to the people in the room and the issues they're bringing up and encourage discussion and not feel like you have to do every single little thing because that may, again, hit that law of diminishing returns. And then lastly, obviously, we were doing an outcomes evaluation where we were looking at trauma, mental health, and relationship outcomes for youth who had experienced trauma who were enrolled in this study. We used a wide range of standardized scales in order to evaluate these outcomes. They completed surveys on paper and were given an incentive for research participation. And then we collected follow-up data primarily, again, through paper surveys, but because of COVID, that was challenging and we had to do all of these really, I have funny pictures because we like to document everything that we do in various ways of staff leaving bags of blank surveys that hadn't been filled out on doorsteps and letting agencies know your surveys are here and then backing away so that no one would be exposed during COVID. And so we went to all kinds of extremes to try to make sure we continue to collect data during the pandemic. Next slide. So this is the list of evaluation measures and our timeframes. We do have a program satisfaction measure that we developed through many years of training evaluation and evaluation of these kinds of programs. That was done at the end of the training. We had a learning measure that was a knowledge test that we developed based on the Mind Matters curriculum that we administered at baseline and follow-up. We did measure skill acquisition. So one of the evaluation techniques that we use is we'll take a standardized curriculum and from that identify concrete skills that people should be able to use as a result of that program. And so from that, we generated a list of approximately 18 skills that people should acquire through their participation in Mind Matters. And we had participants rate their comfort level with those skills. This is a very skills-focused program. As I mentioned, we measured fidelity through that fidelity checklist. Normally, we would do self-assessment of fidelity as well as having one of our data collectors go in and do assessment of fidelity. Periodically, we would observe. That was, again, impacted by COVID and our ability to go into facilities because the residential facilities were shut down to outside visitors until, honestly, this spring. And even then, we've been shut down a couple of more times because of outbreaks. And so we just really had to try to work around that. For other outcomes for things like emotional regulation, so we use the DIRS, the Difficulties in Emotional Regulation Scale. For well-being, we use the Pediatric Symptoms Checklist. We looked at interpersonal skills because, as I said, there was a very heavy emphasis on relationship skill building in the program, using the Social Competence Scale for teenagers. For trauma, we used both the ACEs and the UCLA PTSD checklist. And then for resiliency, we used the Connor-Davidson Resiliency Scale. All of these surveys can be made available via Dibble if they are of interest to anyone. Next slide. And so I'll tell you a little bit about our implementation. Next slide. So we did the training of facilitators, and the scores were very high with an average of 77% correct on the knowledge test. Satisfaction ranged from 76 to 105 out of a total possible score of 105 with average of 95. So very high satisfaction with the training. And then we actually looked at the trauma scores of the facilitators because we know that many people who go into this kind of work, these sorts of social service agency settings may have trauma histories of their own and that can be impactful. That certainly came up quite a bit in the training of facilitators, and we got some really good feedback about being very intentional about how we support and address that within the context of the training of facilitators. The average ACEs score for our facilitators was a 4, so for those of you who are familiar with ACEs and the cutoffs, that it puts people at the average being in the highest category. Next slide. That does have important implications as we think about secondary and vicarious trauma for those who are providing this program, and that is an area for future research. As I said, we've gotten some really good qualitative data and feedback from facilitators on this, and both the power of participating as a facilitator of this program, but also the challenges that go along with that. And this is just giving you a visual depiction of that training evaluation data in terms of satisfaction and knowledge gain. Next slide. So the areas of greatest competence from the training were things like active listening, making space, and using SMART goals. There was 100% mastery of those, close to 98% mastery of things like our vagus nerve activity, the peripheral vision technique, a mindfulness technique, and building on our support networks, and then close to 94% mastery of things like ACEs, tapping, and other kinds of self-care and relational skills. Next slide. So we ended up with 49 participants randomized to the control condition, 54 randomized to the experimental condition, keeping in mind the control condition was a waiting list comparison or control group so that those youth have or will receive Mind Matters, for a total sample size to date of 103. And the additional numbers of how many people were able to complete both pre and post surveys is reported below. As a result of COVID, we had a lot of difficulty collecting follow-up data because of restrictions on getting things to agencies, and also youth being discharged from facilities because there were so many challenges associated with COVID. Many of the youth were discharged from residential to go home. Next slide. Our plan as we continue to implement this, I will say, is to shift back into more community-based settings and not such a heavy emphasis on residential. We have learned quite a bit about implementing programs like this in residential, and I'll talk about that at the end. But we were really trying to maximize those that we were able to train prior to COVID, and now we have the opportunity to open that up and go back into the community-based settings now that some of our restrictions have lifted. And this just gives you an illustration of what our fidelity checklist looks like, and we ask people to report, did they not cover this at all, which is a rating of 1? Was it partially covered, which is a rating of 2? Or was it thoroughly covered, which is a rating of 3? And of the activities that were contained within that module, which of those did they complete? And you can see the activities are listed there. So this is a fidelity checklist we developed that, again, can be made available if that is of interest. Next slide. This gives you an idea of the fidelity data we have covered, we have collected to date. The dark blue, which is the majority of this graph, means that they rated that as thoroughly covered. They covered almost all of the content in that module. There are a few pieces where it was partially covered, specifically in Module 5, and then only in Module 3 were there pieces that were not covered at all, and I can talk about what those were as we move forward. Next slide. So before we get into the preliminary outcomes, we have another poll, and this is for you because this is a research study, and we did have a number of outcomes. We have a lot of outcome data we're going to share with you. This is a chance for you to make some guesses about, now that you know more about the program and what we were evaluating, which of these areas, and it is select all that apply, do you think improved as a result of Mind Matters? Which of these areas? Okay, so the majority of people felt like interpersonal skills and resiliency. 88% of people thought that would improve. 77% thought emotional regulation. 63% thought well-being and trauma. And then 54% thought skill acquisition, and 47% thought learning. So hang on to what you thought, because I'm about to show you what we actually found. So next slide. This just gives you a breakdown of the demographics of the youth that we served. And so about 57% of the participants were white or Caucasian, 34% were African American, 7% Native American, and 2% Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And then 84% were female, 11% identified as male, and then we had the remaining 5% identifying as transgender, gender nonconforming, or gender fluid. And then in terms of sexual orientation, 55% were heterosexual, and the remaining 45% identified as a sexual minority, identifying as bisexual, asexual, gay or lesbian, pansexual, or other. And so we did have quite a bit of diversity in our sample, which is important given our findings that we'd be able to talk about differences by demographic variables and being the relevance and appropriateness of the curriculum for diverse groups. Average age of participants was 15.81. Next slide. So we did see a significant difference in knowledge from pre to post. Knowledge tests are always tough, especially when we're dealing with at-risk youth, because there are some testing issues in addition to measuring the impact of the curriculum. And so finding knowledge gain is important. What we have here is the knowledge gain for the experimental group. When we compare that to the control group, it is significantly greater for the experimental group than in the control group, which you would think would be just a logical guaranteed assumption there, but that often is not the case, where programs really don't detect a difference between the experimental and control group for various testing reasons and population reasons. And so there was an improvement in knowledge. There was also a significant improvement in skills. The rating and what you have in this chart on the right is the list of skills that were evaluated based on the coping skills that were taught in the curriculum. And you have the mean rating on a 5-point scale. And the darker blue line is the pre-test rating, and the lighter blue line is the post-test rating. And you can see that for each of those skills, for all of the skills, there is an improvement in the mean rating from pre to post, meaning in every area, the kids felt more confident in their ability to use those skills after going through the curriculum. Next slide. It's also important that we understand the context of the population that we're serving before we get into the outcomes. And that includes the consideration of their ACEs scores. And so you have here the breakdown by percentage of youth that report ACEs ranging from 0 to 10. So there are 10 is the total possible score we can get on the ACEs. Again, ACEs is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey that lists 10 different kinds of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, things like having a parent with mental illness and substance abuse issues, incarceration, domestic violence, and divorce are the household dysfunction issues. And then the abuse is physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and neglect. And so we know that falling into that category of 4 or more ACEs is really impactful in terms of outcomes and predicts a number of things lifelong. And then in terms of the national distribution of ACEs scores, this is for the population as a whole. The total percentage of the population that report a score of 4 or more is 12.5%. 15% of women, about 9% of men. And you can look at this chart and see we had 8% who had a score of 4, 8% who had a score of 5, 1% who had a score of 6, 7% who had a score of 7, 13% who had a score of 8, 1% who had a score of 9, and 15% who had a score of 10. So adding those up, you can see that our percentage of youth who fall into that 4 or more category is significantly, dramatically higher than the national average. Next slide. What that means is we have a particularly vulnerable population that is going to be really difficult to have an impact on because they come in with such a significant trauma history. This is the prevalence of ACEs by type. On the left, you have from our sample, and on the right, you have the national prevalence. And so you can see that the dark blue indicates the percentage that have experienced these things. So the most commonly reported things that people have experienced were things like physical neglect and parental divorce. But we also have a really significant percentage of people reporting abuse, 54% sexual abuse, 55% physical abuse, 53% emotional abuse. And that is much, much higher than the national rate. Next slide. So then we move into difficulties in emotional regulation. We're going to start to, did we skip one slide? We went quickly and I thought I saw something flash. No, we're good. Okay, thank you. So next is difficulties in emotional regulation. So this is one of those areas that people predicted would improve. What we found is that there were some slight, but not always statistically significant improvements in emotional regulation for those who participated in Mind Matters. And so from pre to post, most of these go in the right direction. So non-acceptance of emotional responses, meaning a sort of rejection of having an emotional reaction, difficulty engaging in goal-directed behavior, impulse control difficulties, lack of emotional awareness went down, limited access to emotional regulation strategies, and lack of emotional clarity. So these are worded in different ways, and what I can tell you is that they move in the right direction, but they're not statistically significant. And much of that, we've had much discussion about this within our research team and with our partners, and much of this we anticipate is because a lot of our sample comes from a residential setting, and it's really difficult to affect change in emotional regulation in that treatment milieu. Particularly in the midst of the pandemic. And so further study is needed on this outcome. Next slide. The pediatric symptoms checklist, this is the breakdown by item in terms of how frequently these kinds of behaviors are occurring. And actually we see an increase in a lot of these kinds of behaviors, like being fidgety, not being able to sit still, daydreaming, worrying, is easily distracted, taking things that don't belong to them. So we actually saw that behavior to some extent worsened from pre to post. Again, hard to tease out how much of that was being in a residential setting in the midst of COVID. And so we're excited to be able to look at this in a community-based setting because we know that there were external factors that impacted this outcome. Next slide. Social competence. Here we are looking at the kinds of skills that kids have, that youth have for navigating important social relationships, like not making other kids look bad, finding a way to help mediate an argument, doing your share when you're in a group at school, discussing a problem with a friend without making it worse, following the rules, respecting others' point of views, getting along with people of different races and cultures, listening to others' ideas, and controlling your anger. We did not see significant improvement in social competence through this particular sample, but we'll again continue to look at this. Next slide. We do see some significant improvements in several pieces of resiliency. So dealing with whatever comes in particular, and overall we see improvements in resiliency from pre to post. Next slide. We also see significant improvements in PTSD symptoms from pre to post. So for PTSD symptoms, we use the UCLA PTSD checklist, and that breaks PTSD symptoms down into the 3 diagnostic categories that are typically associated with PTSD, that include re-experiencing avoidance and arousal symptoms. And we do see a significant decrease in PTSD symptoms for those who go through the program from pre to post. And so they're re-experiencing or intrusion symptoms, things like having flashbacks and memories and thinking of things when you don't want to, that gets significantly better. The avoidance symptoms are things like sort of that emotional blunting or numbing that happens, and avoiding certain people or situations that make them feel triggered, and that goes down significantly. And then the arousal symptoms are feeling constantly on edge, hypervigilance, startling to loud noises, etc. And that also shows a significant decrease. So this is one of our primary positive outcomes that we found related to this program. In addition to the significant improvements that we see in knowledge and skill, we are seeing a significant improvement in PTSD symptoms. And given that this is a program that's focused on trauma, building coping skills for resiliency and long-term growth, those are really critical outcomes in terms of showing preliminary positive impact. Next slide. So now I'm going to move into looking at some of the group differences. Next slide. So we looked at differences in satisfaction based on race, sexuality, and ACEs scores. We actually see that those who have higher ACEs scores were significantly more satisfied with the program. So you would think that those who come in with a significant trauma history would not necessarily really like talking about trauma and all of these pieces as much, but they actually enjoyed it more, which I think really speaks to the power of the program. We do see that those who identify as bisexual and heterosexual report a higher level of satisfaction than those who identified as gay, lesbian, or other. And then in terms of race and ethnicity, our highest level of satisfaction came from those who are biracial or multiracial, followed by our white participants. Next slide. We looked at, in addition to general satisfaction, we looked at things like group cohesion. So how connected did they feel to other people in the group? And we did find that in terms of connectedness by race, our white participants felt the most connection to others in the group. And in terms of sexuality, those who identified as bisexual or other felt the most connected to the group. Remember, 45% of our participants identified as a sexual minority, and so that's an important finding. And then those who had a higher ACEs score reported more feeling of connection to the group and to the program. Next slide. In terms of differences in knowledge, we saw the greatest endpoint knowledge, we said, for the experimental group versus the control group. By race, we found that our Black and African American participants had the highest scores on that knowledge test at the end. Our bisexual and gay or lesbian participants had the highest knowledge scores by sexual orientation. And then, despite having had higher levels of satisfaction in group cohesion, our people with the higher ACEs scores, those who fell into the category of 4 or more, had slightly less post-knowledge than those who had fewer ACEs, which may in fact speak to what we know about the impact of trauma on learning and information processing. Next slide. In terms of behavior change, we see the highest level of self-reported skill for our white and Black or African American participants. In terms of sexual orientation for our heterosexual participants. In terms of gender identity, our male participants show the greatest behavior change in terms of skill and mastery. And for our ACEs scores, those who fell in the 4 or more ACEs category had the highest level of skill acquisition, which again is great because they have a significant trauma history that they're coping with. So to know that they came away with even more coping skills as self-reported was really important. Next slide. In terms of PTSD symptoms, this is just looking at PTSD symptoms at post. Our Black or African American participants reported the lowest frequency of PTSD symptoms by race. Our heterosexual and other category reported the lowest level of PTSD symptoms by sexual orientation. Our male participants reported the lowest level of PTSD symptoms by gender identity, and those who fell into the 0 to 3 ACEs category reported fewer PTSD symptoms, but just marginally so, the mean being 44.3 for those in the 0 to 3 category and 45.12 for those in the 4 or more category. Given the difference in the number of ACEs that people have experienced, that close mean between those two groups is also notable. Next slide. In terms of resiliency, we see the highest resiliency scores for our biracial group. We see the highest resiliency scores for our heterosexual group, followed by the other group. We see our highest resiliency scores for our males, and then we see very similar resiliency scores regardless of ACEs category, which again is important. Ties back to the skill building piece that was on the previous slide, because again, those coping skills and the skill acquisition really tie into our resiliency. Next slide. In terms of the pediatric symptoms checklist, which is our overall well-being scale, we see that we want a lower score here. Our best scores are again among our Black or African American participants, among our gay or lesbian participants, followed by the other category, and then by the people with 4 or more ACEs have the fewest symptoms as measured by the pediatric symptoms checklist. Next slide. In terms of emotional regulation, so having difficulty in emotional regulation, so higher scores are bad because that means you're having more difficulty in emotional regulation. So lower scores are what we're looking at. Again, our Black or African American participants have lower scores in that difficulty with emotional regulation. Those in the other category in heterosexual, bisexual orientation, males, and those with 0 to 3 ACEs have less difficulty with emotional regulation. So we're seeing very similar trends by groups across each of these outcomes with our Black or African American youth. Really faring the best by race, our males faring the best by gender, and there being somewhat equivalency depending on ACEs, and then there's some variability in sexual orientation by outcome. Next slide. In terms of social competency, we want a higher score here. So we see the highest level of social competency among our white participants, our gay or lesbian participants, our male participants, and our kids with 4 or more ACEs, which again, is notable that they come away feeling more socially competent despite having a more significant trauma history. Next slide. So then we look at pre to post change. Next slide. So we see behavior change in the experimental group is on the left, control group is on the right. There's a significant improvement pre to post for the experimental group and not for the control group, which is good because they didn't get the training. So if they reported that they could do these skills better at post, then that would call into question our tests or some reporting bias. And so that's positive finding. Our PTSD symptoms go down significantly, statistically significantly for the experimental group from pre to post. And then for the control group, they actually go up, which is never a positive finding. It's marginal. The means are very close, 29 to 30 from pre to post. And again, these kids in the control group are getting or have received Mind Matters as of now. But that just shows you again that we're seeing an improvement for the experimental group that we're not seeing for the control group, which was the point of running this kind of study. Next slide. For the pediatric symptoms checklist, we are seeing increases for both groups. Again, we don't know how much of that was confounded by being in a residential setting and by COVID. So more study is needed, hopefully outside of COVID and hopefully outside of the residential setting and more community-based settings, which we're already building partnerships around now. And then the resiliency scores improve for both groups, which when you think about this, all of these kids we partner with community-based organizations that are already serving youth. And so we hope to see improvements in some of these things as a result of treatment as usual. So they're in a residential setting, they're getting group therapy, they're getting individual therapy, the therapeutic milieu is supposed to be a treatment. And so we expect to see improvements in many of these things over time, but we can see that the rate of change, the degree of change for the experimental group is quite different than it is for the control group, meaning there's more of an improvement in resiliency for the experimental group than there is for the control group, suggesting that Mind Matters has contributed to improvements in resiliency for those who actually participated in the program. Next slide. Difficulties in emotional regulation go down for the experimental group from 104 to 102, and they go up quite a bit for the control group. The social competency goes up for the experimental group while it goes down for the control group. So again, in the right direction. These are outcomes going in the right direction for the experimental group. We're seeing some decompensation in the control group, which may, again, be the result of the combination of the difficulty of the residential setting and COVID. Next slide. That brings us to the end, and I'm going to try to summarize the wealth of information I've shared. And so next slide, and I'll try to leave 5 minutes for questions. In terms of satisfaction, knowledge, and skill, we see high levels of satisfaction, moderate levels of group cohesion, a significant increase in knowledge for the experimental group, more knowledge gain for the experimental group than the control group, and then we see differences by race, gender, sexuality, and ACEs, similar patterns across those outcomes. We also see a significant improvement in the trauma coping skills for the experimental group pre to post. And then we've identified some of the specific skills where we see the greatest change. Next slide. In terms of PTSD symptoms, there was a significant difference in PTSD symptoms between the experimental and control group. And that's really of critical importance given that we're dealing with trauma, a highly traumatized youth population, and this is a trauma coping and resiliency curriculum. And so seeing that statistically significant improvement in PTSD symptoms for the experimental group, and that there was a difference for the experimental group that did not exist for to the same degree for the control group is really important. And then we give you a breakdown of some of the specific areas or symptoms of PTSD that showed an improvement. Next slide. In terms of resiliency and well-being, we see an improvement in resiliency scores for both groups, which again may be explained by the fact that they're in treatment, they're receiving other kinds of treatment, but their improvement in the resiliency scores for the experimental group, the Mind Matters group, was greater than it was for the control group. Many of the symptoms on the pediatric symptoms checklist, which was one of our well-being measures, increased from pre to post. Again, we see a deterioration often when kids enter residential. We know that kids really struggle during COVID, and so we don't attribute that or link that necessarily to participation in the program, but really all of those outset factors. And so we hope to be able to continue to study that and see what happens without those external factors confounding the study. Next slide. In terms of emotional regulation, there was not a significant change in emotional regulation, although the experimental group decreased slightly in that difficulty with emotional regulation while the control group got worse. So it was in the right direction. There were significant changes in a couple of things, like I pay attention to how I feel, and when upset, I take time to figure out how I feel, or when upset, I lose control over my behavior. So we can see a couple of areas where it's starting to show a change. More study is needed outside of this context and with a larger sample size. We see a slight increase in social competence for the experimental group and a slight decrease in social competence for the control group. Many of these findings that may not have been statistically significant, we attribute to the smaller sample size and the difficulty we had with some of the data collection as a result of pandemic-related restrictions, which we will address through further study. Next slide. So future implications, we do plan to continue to test the program with this rigorous design. We're going to expand to other settings. We're already in discussion with some community-based settings that serve at-risk youth. We are going to add longer follow-up data collection points, so looking at things further out to see if these changes are sustained and to get to our target sample size of 200, which is really just a benchmark for establishing the evidence base of this program that we will reach over the next year. We do need additional research to explore the impact on each of these target outcomes, taking into consideration some of those demographic variables in childhood trauma history. We're starting to see some important trends here as it relates to their ACEs scores and various demographic variables like sexual orientation, race, gender, identity. But we need to understand those more so that we can say with confidence, not only does the program work, but for whom and under what circumstances. And then, as I have said a number of times, future studies will be more feasible without some of the constraints of COVID-19 on community-based organization. Although the pandemic has added layers of trauma to at-risk youth that have been important for us to be able to address through this preliminary research, and will continue to be important for us to address in an ongoing way, as we know that those impacts will continue for many years to come. That brings us to the end. Any questions?
Thanks, Becky. I'm waiting to see if some questions come in. A lot of really exciting findings and information in the webinar. So me, this just says we'll call you back again at some point. See if the questions are coming in. I think people are just trying to process all the wonder and amazing, things that you found, especially with 50% almost of people being new to the curriculum, which is exciting. Glad to have you all here with us. I don't see any questions because you were so thorough, but if y'all do have questions, I do want to say that there's going to be the opportunity to submit those to us. So again, thank you so much, Becky, for being here and for presenting your findings so far, and I look forward to seeing what you learned. Like you said, hopefully now that things have slowed down a little bit in terms of the COVID world, and to see how it plays out with more opportunities for delivery. We have a great presentation comment in the question box. So I think, to me, that says that we have no questions. So I want to say thank you too to everybody else who joined us on today's webinar. Like I said, there is a brief survey, so if you can take a few minutes to complete that survey, especially those of you who messaged saying that you're really interested in learning more about the curriculum, please fill out that survey. That'd be really helpful. And also, if you've got any questions that you'd like for either us at Dibble or for Becky to answer, you can connect with us at our website. More Wednesday webinars. We're talking and posting about grant opportunities, current research, more networking. So know that there's lots of opportunities on our website available to y'all. The other thing, I see a question that I will answer actually. So the webinar will be available in about 3 days or so. It'll be posted on our website, so you will be able to go back, review it, and any kind of additional materials that may be helpful will be all linked in the site there. So you will be able to go ahead and access that. You can also get continuing education or CEU credits for attending some of our other webinars that are available through our recording. So if you're interested in that, that's available on our website that you see hyperlinked there. So dibbleinstitute.org/CEUs. So go ahead and check those out. And I do want to take a quick moment to highlight our webinar that's coming up next month. So this one is slightly different than our usual free Wednesday webinar. So this is a paid 3-hour training. It costs $35 per person, and there will not be a recording available of that webinar. So it's the Hidden Biases of Good People, Implicit Bias Awareness Training. It's hosted by Dibble and the Morehouse College, and seats are selling out fast. The event is listed on our webpage at dibbleinstitute.org, where you can purchase tickets. And like I said, those tickets are selling out fast. If you are interested in joining us, please get your tickets soon, because sales will either close November 5th or when we run out. So if you're interested, go to the website right now and sign up, because we don't have very much left. And on that note, thanks again, everybody, for being here today. Thank you, Becky, and we look forward to hearing more from you, and then hopefully seeing everybody next month at our November webinar. So thanks, everyone.